Thanks a lot. Thanks, Dave, for presenting and covering the Azure stuff. And now I'd like to show you how to deploy a NetScaler in Azure. There are a few things you have to know at first. Just let me click. NetScaler can be deployed in single IP mode. I saw a question right now. This is the old way. Yeah, I think 2 months ago, Microsoft announced that multiple IP mode is supported and multiple NIC mode is also supported, which means that you can use your NetScaler with more than one IP address. So it came out with a single IP mode, which means that you have to use only one IP address in your NetScaler. This is not really easy to use because you have got your management running on the same IP address like your NetScaler gateway or your load balancing services. So this was not very good to handle because you have to do some network address translation, port address translation stuff. And Citrix decided to change this into multiple IP mode assigned to one NIC so that you have one network interface running in your NetScaler environment and assign a few IP addresses to it so that you have one IP address for your management separated from your subnet IP address and separated from all of your virtual IP addresses. So another way to deploy a NetScaler in Azure is that you can use multiple network interfaces on your NetScaler. So therefore, it is important to know that you need more than one subnet in your resource group, that you can deploy one network interface in subnet A and one interface in subnet B. So onto this multiple network interfaces, you have the possibility to also bind multiple IP addresses. So if you want to split up your traffic in front end and back end, you can do it with multiple IP addresses on multiple network interfaces. You have some requirements in Azure which you have to deploy first. So as Dave mentioned, you need a resource group, you need a availability set, and you also need a virtual network. So this is what we have to do at first in Azure so that you can deploy your NetScaler. I will cover this later on in a demo. And another important thing is that you bring your own licensing. So if you have deployed your NetScaler, you need to bring your own license. So you have to buy a VPX license like you do on premises. So just give me 1 second. In my opinion, you don't have to use single IP mode at all. In my session, I will cover multiple IP address mode and multiple NIC mode as well, so that you can see what you can do with your NetScaler right now. So the requirements are at all time the same. So you need a virtual IP address on your NetScaler, and for every virtual IP address, you need your public IP address. So this will be configured in Azure on your network interfaces. Dave mentioned that you can configure static IP addresses. This will also work for public IP addresses. So you can configure your IP address to be static on your NetScaler. Very important thing to know is that you have to configure your security groups in Azure. So there are some inbound and outbound rules you have to configure. You can see it on the right screen. I've configured some settings for HTTP, HTTPS, and yeah, for test scenario, also port 444. So this is single IP mode. What I mentioned, don't use it. Use a configuration like this so that you use multiple IP addresses on your NetScaler.
Carsten, can you elaborate a little bit about why people shouldn't use the single IP mode?
Yes, of course. So in single IP mode, you have, I will step back. You will have only one IP address running in your NetScaler. So that means that your NetScaler management IP address called NetScaler IP will run on the same IP address like your virtual IP addresses. So as you know, you have to configure your NetScaler by default on HTTP and HTTPS, which means that if you are only having one IP address, you have to work with other ports for your virtual IP addresses. So for example, if you want to deploy NetScaler Gateway, you have to configure NetScaler Gateway to run on port 444 or on port 10443, something like this. And this is not easy to handle because you have to create a port address translation rule on an Azure-based load balancer, which you have to place before your NetScaler. So the traffic will go to the public IP address and then to the port address translation through Azure Load Balancer to go to your NetScaler gateway. So this is not easy to handle, and I think it's not the way modern architecture is like. So they will have.
So basically, it's less secure, providing some security risks to have just a single IP mode, and you are entering a more complex NetScaler configuration to make up for it, right?
Yes, that's right. And also for all your load balancing stuff. So if you want to load balance storefront, as example, you have to load balance storefront on the same IP address like your NetScaler gateway and your management interface. And for security reasons, I don't want to do this. And you have to deal a lot with security rules. So this is not easy to handle. And this is a reason why I say don't use single IP mode at all.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
You're welcome. So if you want to deploy NetScaler in multiple IP mode, you will have with one network interface, forgot this, you need multiple IP addresses configured on your network interface. So the deployment will be nearly the same. So you will deploy your NetScaler in Azure, and then you will get your network interface and you have to do some configurations on it. So in Azure, it is called IP configuration, where you configure your IP addresses. This can be private IP addresses or public IP addresses. The scenario, therefore, will be you've only one subnet running in Azure, and you want to use your NetScaler as reverse proxy or NetScaler gateway. Yeah, I put it again, you have to configure your security groups as well. So therefore, you have to configure security groups for every single IP address you want to deploy on your network interface. So for example, if you have running your NetScaler IP on ipconfig 1, you have to configure the security group to let the traffic through from your management in network to IP configuration 1 on several ports. And if you are running a NetScaler gateway on IP configuration 2, you have to configure your subnet for letting traffic on HTTPS through from the internet. So you can define it in very granular way, but you have to configure it for the IP configurations and not for the subnet. Because if you configure it for the subnet, all IP addresses will have the same rules. So if you want to deploy it in a very high secure level, you can use multiple network interfaces on your NetScaler, and you can place the different network interfaces into different subnets so that you can configure your security groups on subnet level, which is much easier to handle because you can say, okay, every single network interface in this particular subnet will have the same ports addressable. So for example, if you look on the right side, we have got in site 1 running in NetScaler, which is my VM1 with network interface 1. And there we have got the external traffic, like NetScaler Gateway or like publishing load balancers for reverse proxy scenarios. So, and you can configure your subnet to use this network interface, and then you can configure your security group directly to the subnet that allows traffic on port 443. And the backend communication will be to the server farm, and there you can configure other ports like 80 or the management ports or stuff like this. And so you can place more than one NetScaler in the same subnets, and you will always get the same security groups. So this is a little bit easier to handle, and I think it's a little bit more secure, and you can reach out with this traffic separation so that the front end communication is separated from the back end communication. Esther, are there any questions?
Sorry, I muted myself. Yes, there are some questions, and I was very busy typing some answers. So
Okay.
Please be patient, people. I always need a lot of words to try to explain things. Let me check. Patrick is letting us know that he says it's true what Carsten says, but he's still wondering if high availability becomes more complex if you use a multiple IP scenario. So can you maybe elaborate on that?
Yeah. From my opinion, I would like to use global server load balancing, which is available right now in Azure, to build up high availability between some NetScalers. Because if you use GSLB for high availability, you will also get a scalability within. So this is a lot complexer than building up just an HA pair and running on premises. That's right. But I think you have a lot more scalability if you use global server load balancing. But yeah, right, it's more complex.
Thank you for answering that. I think that covers Patrick's question. And I have another question regarding GSLB and whether that needs more licenses if you are doing a GSLB configuration.
I have to check it, but I think you need enterprise licenses.
Okay, well then we can always reply to that question afterwards on the networking SIG forum on my CUGC.
Yes, of course. We can do that.
And one more quick question from Mohammed. He says, hi, there any performance advantage if we use NetScaler on Office premises rather than Azure? So basically he's asking if it's on premises, does that give us a performance advantage in addition to Azure?
Okay, I will cover this a little bit later.
Perfect.
So I did a little bit of load testing, and I will cover this later.
then I'll let you continue and get back to you if there are some new questions.
Okay, thank you. So, brand new in Azure is NetScaler MARS. So, I think all of you know what NetScaler MARS is. It's a management and analytics services for NetScaler. And I was really waiting for this feature because if you try to connect your on-premises MARS with your Azure NetScaler, you need an express route between your data center and your Azure, and you have to open up all ports because MARS is testing the NetScalers on dynamically high ports. So you need really every port opened in your network. So now you can place your NetScaler MARS directly in Azure and use it. The reason why I want to use it is poor licensing. Because the problem in Azure right now is if you redeploy your NetScaler, the network interfaces will also be redeployed, which means VPX systems are licensed by MAC addresses. And if you redeploy your NetScaler, the MAC address will change. This is not a big problem because how many times do you redeploy your NetScaler? I think it will be not that often, but if you know that there's no update feature on Azure to update your firmware in NetScaler, you have to redeploy it if you want to get an update. So on every single update, you have to redeploy your NetScaler in Azure, and this means you need a new license file. And with pooled license on NetScaler MARS services will be covered so that you can use your VPX system saying, okay, use a license which is running on my MARS, and then it will check it out, and you don't need to configure it running for the MAC address on your virtual instance. You have to configure the license to run on your MARS service. So, really cool feature. I talked a lot, and now I'd like to show you how to deploy a NetScaler live in my Azure environment, and hopefully it runs a little bit faster than 10 minutes ago. I tested it, it was a little bit slow, so I'm a little bit sorry about this. Okay, this is my Azure portal, and if you have this set up and it is running, you have to create some resource groups, and I've already done this, so I will only cover how to deploy a NetScaler. Therefore, you click on a new, because you want to deploy a new machine. You only search for NetScaler, and they will come up with a few NetScalers, version 11, 11.1, and 12, and also NetScaler MA Service Agent, and also NetScaler SD-WAN. So I choose 11.1, and it's really easy. Get a little description, and you can click on Create. The next window is designing your machine. So you have to configure some basic settings. One important thing is the name. Virtual disk type, just use HDD because SSD is really expensive, and there's no need because NetScaler's architecture is using CPU and RAM and not the disk. So HDD will save you a lot of money because you don't need SSD on your NetScaler. So then you have to type in a username, which can't be root, NSRoot, or administrator. So I use NSAdmin. And for being a little bit lazy, I type in password. It has to be a very long password, around 12 characters. And then you can choose your resource group, which we created earlier. I can use this one and click OK. That are the basic settings, and now you can choose your machine. Okay, there's a recommended setting, which is a A2 machine, which has 2 cores and 3.5 gig of RAM. And you can click, it's a little trick, on View All. Then all machines will be shown to you, and I figured out that DS2 version 2 is running very good. Or if you want to have a little bit more power, you can also use VMs like A2M version 2, which has 16 gig of RAM. If you do a lot of caching or stuff like this, 16 gig will be very good. So I choose this machine because 2 cores and 7 GB of RAM will be enough for me. And then I have to configure a little bit of optional settings. It takes really a long time.
Okay, then I'm just gonna quickly ask, one of the questions is that if it's an option to upgrade your Azure NetScaler build, or do you have to stick with the version that you deploy initially?
Yeah, okay, there's no update available for Azure because this is not a standard VPX. It's a special build. So you have to delete your NetScaler and build up a new one. So you have to export your configuration, shut the machine down, delete the machine, create a new one, put your configuration on, and this is the update. The only way it will work.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on that. But that sounds like a lot of work to just do a simple upgrade. Okay,
Esther, you can automate it.
That was my next question. Can I use the ARM templates to kind of deploy the NetScaler and then use PowerShell scripts to automate it with the REST API?
To keep it short, yes.
Okay, cool. Then I will get back to that in the future.
Okay, yeah, I think we have another webinar in August or September covering this stuff. So this is why I keep it short. Okay, so in these settings you can configure your network. I've my basic network. I have a subnet. I have only one subnet, so okay. And I will get a new IP address. It's a public IP address, and it will also create a new security group for me. I can configure this later, so there's no things to do. If you want to use high availability groups, you have to set up a availability set. This is very important to know because you can't change it after you created the machine. So if you want to use high availability, so that the NetScalers are running in different data centers, you have to configure it right now. It's the only point you can do it. I don't need it because it's a test machine, so I click OK, and then I will get a little summary, and afterwards I can click on Buy, and my machine will be deployed. So yeah, little summary to sum up everything what I've configured, and if I want I can step a little bit back, and as Esther mentioned, okay, at this time I can download a template, and we will cover this later because to explain it will be too much in this webinar. So, and now I've got some information about the price. Mine is in euro, so there will be a different price if you purchase it in another country. So that's all. NetScaler will be deployed. It will take a little bit time. So I will click on my virtual machines because I've prepared a NetScaler. Like this one. So at first you will get a little overview, and as I said, you have your network interfaces. So here we got one network interface, and I think I have configured a little bit more. I've got only one IP address running because I've got only one subnet at this time. So if I want to configure more network interfaces, I have to configure an additional subnet. So the network interfaces has to be placed in two different subnets, and this will not work in my environment. I will work out this later. So yeah, it is really slow. So I really like to show you something, but it's too slow at the moment. Yeah, there it is. IP configurations. So if you click on your network interface, you can go on IP configurations, and hopefully it will work right now. Yeah, and there you can see I've got a lot of IP configuration running on my NetScaler. The private IP addresses are all static, and I've got configured also some public IP addresses. Some are static, as you can see right here. These two are static, and the one who's unassigned is dynamic. And this is the reason is because my NetScaler is shut down, and Azure will directly unassign dynamic public IP addresses. So I can click on network security groups to show you the network security group settings. It's really slow. Okay, I think this will take too much time. So I will cover this later in a little blog article or something like this in my CUGC, and I will continue with my presentation because the portal of Azure is not working very well at the moment. So somebody asked about what is with performance on NetScaler in Azure, and what is about performance with NetScaler on-premises. So on-premises, it is not easy to cover because it is depending on your hypervisor, which version on hypervisor are you running, which CPUs, which RAM, etc. pp. So this is a lot of stuff to cover to say, okay, you're getting 100 or you're getting 200 or 500 users running on your VPX. So I decided to test a little bit what performance we get in NetScaler running on Azure. Therefore, I used Login VSI. I had a little setup for stress testing. So Login VSI is a tool which will open up some sessions on Xenap systems. Therefore, you have got Login VSI Launcher, which you can see on the left side. I've got created 4 launches to handle 100 sessions. So each launcher will cover 25 sessions against my NetScaler and starting them on my Xenap environment. The Xenap environment is running on Azure, like my NetScaler. So the second point, oh, that was too fast. The second point you need is a Login VSI controller, which also holds a Login VSI share. The share is where the data is in, the configuration is in, and stuff like this. And the share has to be reachable from all launches and all Xenap servers. So I decided to create a second Login VSI share, and I synchronized the files with share-file so that all systems have the same configuration file. This is a little bit about the architecture of Login VSI. In your Login VSI share, you will have configuration files and also some scripts and stuff like this. And some of them will be created just in case you start a test. So you have to sync it to your Azure environment so that the Xenap server has also access to these files. Take a little bit time to configure it, but it will work so that all launchers can start sessions in my Xenap environment. I've created a short video to show you how this works. So as you can see, I've got our Login VSI worker right here. One in the background. Oh, that was too fast. One in the background and one is in front. And there will be started some sessions which are running in Azure, and there's a NetScaler right before. So the Login VSI launcher will start a session which is running in my Azure environment. So hopefully I can show you how the connection will be built up. It will come in a few seconds. So there you can see this is my NetScaler running in Azure. Login VSI is logging in, and then it will start a session on my Xenap environment, and afterwards it will do some browsing and sending some emails, reading some emails, so everything a normal user will do. And this is how I tested the load of the NetScaler in Azure. So first of all, I tried out 25 and 50 users, and I configured my NetScaler with low security. So basic settings, no ciphers, no whatever. So I configured it with SSL version 3, so only to have a little feeling about what's going on. So, and I figured out there's no big difference if you have 25 or 50 users running through your NetScaler on Azure. And I thought, maybe it will change if I do a little bit more security, like A+ rating from SSL Labs. And I tried again 50 users, and there's how to say it, there's no difference. So NetScaler in Azure is working really good with SSL transactions, and so I think you will get around 1,000 users on your VPX in Azure, and you have to configure a little bit more of CPU and a little bit more of RAM to get 1,000 users running. But I think this will be around the number of users you will get there. So this is what I figured out with Login VSI. Hopefully it helps you as well. And this is my presentation. Maybe Esther, we have got some questions.
Yes, Paul Stencil has been asking if we are using a single NIC multiple IP configuration for our NetScaler. Does it matter what the primary IP address is and what the secondary IP address is in regards to which IP address is linked as the NetScaler IP address? And I hope I translated his question correctly.
Okay, so no.
Okay, but
this doesn't matter.
Basically he's just wondering if the NetScaler IP address is always linked to the primary IP, or can it switch? Or is it something you configure yourself?
So yeah, this is a little bit how NetScaler works. So if you have two subnets, and NetScaler will figure out which interface is in which network. So you have only to do your configurations on Azure side, and NetScaler will figure out with ARP requests in which network it will work. So hopefully it covers everything.
So far he's not giving me a hard time, so I guess that covers it.
Okay. So it is important to configure the IP addresses on your Azure side, because Azure is using DHCP for IP addresses, and if Azure doesn't know about the IP addresses which you configured on your NetScaler, it will have it in its pool for DHCP. So you will get this IP address maybe twice and get an IP conflict. So this is the reason why you have to configure your IP addresses.
That makes sense. So thank you for explaining it. And I was checking if there are any more questions that needs to be addressed right now. There was one question regarding the NetScaler configuration if you're building the DMZ NetScaler in Azure and have your XenApp and XenDesktop configuration on premises. If there is some special considerations that we need to take into account.
I think it's depending on what you want on Azure. If you want to create your own DMZ, and you will have different subnets, you can use multiple network interfaces to separate traffic if you want, but it is not necessary to do it. It is only depending on the security level and the handling in Azure, how to deploy your machines and how to deploy security groups. This is the only reason to do stuff like traffic separation or using different network interfaces. So if you want to automate things, it is easier to handle security groups on subnet level than on network interface level.
Okay, thank you. Luckily for me, Paul is not giving me a very hard time right now, so I do not have a lot more questions right now. So maybe we can dive into the DMZ configuration some more on the Networking SIG forum. And for
Sure.
now, thank you very much for the presentation and explaining the NetScaler feature set in Azure.
Thanks a lot for keeping an eye on the questions, Esther.
You're welcome, Carsten.
So let me hand it over to Stephanie.
Sure, let me just grab the screen really quickly. I did put a link in the chat window to the discussion thread that we have open in the networking forum right now on mycugc.org. So if you have more questions or you didn't quite get your answer today or forgot to ask something, feel free to ask them there. We'll make sure that the networking SIG leaders see those questions and get you some answers. I will also send them the questions that were asked today, and we'll probably have them write up a blog post or a longer form post that kind of goes over these questions and answers as well. And again, you will receive a link to the recording of today's presentation in an email tomorrow from GoToWebinar. And other than that, I really want to thank Carsten and Esther and Dave Brett, even though he's not here, and Marius for putting together his portion. I'm really glad we were able to have the webinar, and I'm glad that everyone showed up. And thanks again to all of you, and we will see you again soon at mycugc.org. Thanks, Esther. Thanks, Carsten.
Thanks for having us.